thought I could stop wearing these things. I tried, honestly, I tried. I haven't had a stitch of them on for nearly 2 weeks until tonight. Then I couldn't stand it anymore. I had to put them on or go out of my mind.
Future events such as these will affect you in the future. Hello everyone and welcome to day 15 of Terrorthon. Today I would like to focus on a horror movie director who is often called the worst of all time. Yes, today we are talking about Edward Davis Wood Jr. He is notorious amongst film fans for creating some of the worst movies of all time, including the legendarily bad Plan 9 from Outer Space. But let's get into his history a little bit. So, Ed Wood was born in New York in 1924, and his mother Lillian actually wanted a girl, so she always dressed him up in girls' clothing for that exact reason. From a very early age, Ed Wood was interested in comic books and pulp magazines, and he was absolutely obsessed with movies, like movies about the occult, serials, and westerns, and Bela Lugosi was his ultimate childhood icon. In 1947, he moved to Hollywood and was introduced to his childhood icon Bela Lugosi in 1952 by his roommate Alex Gordon, who was actually involved in the creation of American International Pictures. Though Bela Lugosi's son disputes it, Ed Wood was actually genuine friends with Lugosi. And then in 1953, Ed Wood released his first ever movie, Glenn or Glenda, which was originally simply called I Changed My Sex. It starred Wood under the alias of Daniel Davis, and this is when Ed Wood's girlfriend Dolores Fuller found out that Ed Wood actually was a real transvestite, almost certainly brought on by his mother dressing him in women's clothing as a child. Then, in 1954, his next film came out, a crime film called Jailbait, starring his usual cast of Hollywood misfits, including Lugosi, who was unfortunately struggling so much that he couldn't afford to turn down any work. In 1955, his next movie came out, Bride of the Monster, which also starred Lugosi and the Swedish wrestler Tor Johnson, who would show up in his later works as well. And then in 1956, the big one, Plan 9 from Outer Space. Within the cast of this film were the Swedish wrestler Tor Johnson and the first ever horror host, Vampira herself. Despite Bela Lugosi being dead at this point, he actually featured in the movie because Ed Wood had shot some footage of him in the iconic Dracula cape. And to double for Lugosi, an actor simply covered his face with the cape. Like, this movie is legendarily terrible for good reason. There are so many flubs in it, lines that make no sense. You can see a boom mic shadow at one point, the effects are terrible. The whole thing is just laughable, but to call it the worst movie of all time is a bit much. And I highly recommend getting a group of friends together with a case of beer and watching this movie. You will have the time of your life. But what breaks my heart is what Ed Wood said about the movie. I quote, "Plan 9 is my pride and joy. If you want to know me, see Glenn or Glenda. That's me. That's my story. No question. But Plan 9 is my pride and joy." It hurts me just to read that, man. When you consider the reputation the movie gained years later, it's just horrible. The poor guy. It was dubbed the worst movie of all time in 1980 in the book The Golden Turkey Awards by Michael Medved. Again, as I say, I find this very unfair. There are much worse movies out there. Wood continued to make movies for the rest of his life. Sometimes in his later works, the films would delve into straight pornography, and critics absolutely lambasted him. They tore his work apart, and made a fool of him, and just said that his works were absolutely dog shit, essentially. Despite all of this, Wood never gave up. Despite the low income he had and the critics' reactions to his movies, he constantly pumped them out, always chasing his dream with a real passion for filmmaking. He wrote at least 80 books in his life, and 39 of his movies were unreleased because the scripts were never completed. Then unfortunately in 1978, Wood's depression worsened. He and his wife Kathy had become alcoholics by this point, living in total poverty, before Wood died of a heart attack tragically. However, his legacy endured. In 1994, Tim Burton made a movie all about Ed Wood and his career, simply called Ed Wood, starring Johnny Depp. And in 1996, as a joke, someone formed a Church of Ed Wood, which still endures to this day, and they celebrate Wood Mass every October 10th on Ed Wood's birthday. And there you go, an almost complete history of the underrated director Ed Wood. If his movies were released today, they would be seen as subversive masterpieces, So it's a real shame that he had such a difficult life when he had such a passion for filmmaking, and I hope you will go and investigate his work. And I also recommend the documentary Flying Saucers Over Hollywood, The Plan 9 Companion. Go enjoy. See you tomorrow.